Thanks.
Should we start like once I see it on the live stream? Oh, okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Let me mute myself. Okay. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's presentation workshop. My name is Jenny, and I'm joined with Thomas Hart. We are both part of the financial crime analytics team at Deloitte, and we're really excited to be having this presentation workshop today. I took King's course last year, and I personally really enjoyed the workshop series that we had during my time. And I hope from our presentation today, you'll be able to take away some insights, whether that be for this course or somewhere along your career. So for today's agenda and what we want to cover today, we're going to give a little spiel about who we are. Then we're going to go into a brief intro as to what fraud analytics is. We're going to dive deep into a case study for loyalty fraud, have a section for some career advice, and at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. But at any time, if you have any questions, please feel free to just use the chat box and we'll get to your question. So a little bit about us. So I'm Jenny. I'm a recent MEC grad, so I was in your shoes last year. I wrote the CFE in September and successfully passed. And for my full time, I started off with our financial crime analytics team as an analyst. And in my role here, I wear a couple of different hats. So on a technical perspective, I help with our reporting and data visualization using tools like Tableau, and also using SQL and Excel for data analysis. And from a non-technical perspective, I help with information design and crafting a story to present our analysis and insights to clients. And also recently, I've had the ability to work as a project manager on a recent file. Now I'm going to pass the stage over to Tom for him to share a little bit about himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Thomas Hart. I'm a manager at Deloitte as part of the forensic analytics practice. So I'm also a Waterloo grad, so my background is in physics. And soon after graduating, I joined Deloitte. And there I've worked in a couple of different roles. I started out in sort of the consulting practice, so very business focused. And over the years, found that my passion really lied in the analytics work and working with data. So I've made the switch to a more technical role. Just to give you an idea of what a manager really does. Once you're elevated to the manager level, delivery is sort of table stakes. So you do less of the hands-on work in terms of the analysis. And it's more about recruitment and developing the culture of a team, as well as training and coaching of the people that you work with, and some sales responsibilities as well. So just a little bit about what it's like to be a manager at the manager role in analytics. So wanted to jump in and give you an idea of what fraud analytics sort of looks like in industry. So fraud analytics, I'd say, comes in two streams. And I'll give you some examples to sort of make them real. So first is what I'd call fraud discovery. It's sort of this bottom-up approach. An example of a project I work with is one of the big 5 Canadian banks came to us and said, find all of the mortgage fraud in my mortgage portfolio. So it's a very wide breadth. They're saying, I don't have really any indication of what fraud might look like. But for example, tell me where people are lying about how much income they make in the general fraud portfolio or the mortgage portfolio. So very broad subject. And you're trying to identify those little pockets of fraud within the overall population. The second stream of work is what I would call investigation support. That's where it's a very focused analysis. So one example I can give you there is one of the banks became aware of a customer who had recently been added to a terrorist watch list and needed to go back and identify the transactions over the last 5 years. And identify anything that had to be reported to the RCMP or to CSIS. So let's look at this very specific individual and identify all the suspicious transactions within the last 5 years of their activity to bring it up with the people who need to know. So either we do this very broad work and try and find the needle in the haystack, or this very pointed work where we're really providing context around something that we already know is bad. So with that, what are some of the biggest challenges that we face? I'd say the biggest challenge is first this balancing of the sophistication of analytics and the audience. So what do I mean by that? The typical buyer or client that we're working with is not as sophisticated as you or I might be in terms of analytics and the language that we use and what's best practice today. These people are typically of our parents' generation, so their trust in data and their comfort with analytics is very limited. So you almost have to really work hard to show your work so that they begin to develop this trust. They're not going to be willing to buy something if it's this sort of black box. So balancing how sophisticated we can make an analytic model is really what can we get away with explaining to the layman. So that I think is the biggest challenge. The other two challenges I have there are really for expanding upon that. So once you've created a model, how do you integrate it in these existing processes so that it doesn't become stale? So that's creating the effective feedback loop. And then finally, understanding what limitations are really coming from the data. You'd be surprised how poor data is in the real world and in industry, and learning how to caveat your results appropriately and infer values where you need to. That's a big challenge in doing analytics out in industry today. So before, we're just going to pause for questions in just a second, but I'll take you through what a typical flow looks like in an analytics project. And then we'll dive into almost a use case of that. So first, we have to understand the business issue. So that's step number one. And that guides us into step number two, which allows us to identify what's relevant data to this problem. And we basically collect that all into one place. A lot of this data wasn't designed in a way that makes it easy for source A to talk to source B. So there's a lot of preparation work that goes next to make these sources able to, only into a single golden source, if you will. Step number four is really where we're getting into a bit of data engineering, where you're making hypotheses against the data. You're preparing it for what might be eventually data science and modeling, or you're just preparing those insights to come out of the data that would have been, the needle in the haystack previously. 5, it really supports this iterative process of the machine learning process, right? So you need someone to label your data, to validate your false positives, to validate your true positives, and you need to use that as your training set as you go forward. So really 4 and 5 is almost an iterative process where you're training the model as it exists. And then step number 6 is where you're finally presenting your results and packaging that up into something that can be actioned by the buyer in this case, or your client. So I'll pass it off very quickly to Jenny. She's going to take you through some of the tools that we typically use and how they sort of layer into that process I just described.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different tools that we can leverage as part of the analytics process and to help guide us through that project stream and to fulfill the engagement needs for our clients. But some of the main ones that we use are presented here. So if we need to process and manipulate data, the 2 main tools that we typically use would be SQL and Python. SQL is what we use to talk to a database. So if we need to generate queries for analysis, Alteryx and SSIS are the supporting roles for SQL. So they help load data in to the SQL databases in order to generate these queries in SQL. Python is typically used for more data science focused analysis, so for analyses like text mining. So after all of this processing and manipulations of data and generating all of these insights, we need a way to present this information. And typically we would use Tableau to present the insights that we want to show to clients. So we need to process and analyze a high volume of documents. Say the engagement team needs to analyze thousands and thousands of emails. We might use the tools indicated here. So for example, Brainspace. Brainspace allows you to perform text mining and text analysis on keywords that you might be extracting from these thousands and thousands of emails into one data visualization that you can have on these texts, and allows you to drill down on additional advanced analytics that you might want to perform on the text, and also for additional insights. So if anyone has any questions for this, let us know. And if not, we're going to jump into the case study for loyalty fraud. No questions so far. So Tom, if you want to take it away.
Sure. So what we'll talk about today, think about it like, a case study. So this is like a sanitized real project that we worked on a couple of years ago. So taking you through something that actually happened. And wanted to walk you through sort of what that process looks like and how we integrated analytics to really solve the problem. So think of like a loyalty provider that you're familiar with. So these are things like Air Miles, Triangle, Plum Points, Optimum, your SO card, whatever. So these are all examples of loyalty providers. So where this all started was the business started receiving calls into their call center, and it was something like 200 calls a day, where the customers were calling in and complaining that their points had just vanished. So very quickly, within the first week, this retailer realized that they had a big data breach. So what did that mean? They had to so immediately they understood that there were financial losses. Okay. The call center agents, when they were sort of tracking these calls, they would go into the back end and see where the fraudulent point redemptions were happening. They saw pretty much two patterns. One was these were new devices. So what was happening is I would have my loyalty card, I'm a legitimate customer, and somehow out there, someone else had access to my card number. And they would go onto their own phone and they would add their card or add my card onto their phone. And they were using their phone to redeem my points associated with my card. So they would see a new device being added to the account, and they would see that that new device was responsible for the fraudulent redemption that was eventually taking place. Often these redemptions were happening at stores that the regular customer had never visited, or inside a province where the regular customer didn't live. So they had some indication that, there was real fraud going on. They saw this huge uptick on their site activity, their website activity. So they knew that there was some attack happening on their website, but beyond that, they had no idea as to the scale of the problem. Only the people that had called in, they knew about. Everyone else they were blind to, basically. So initially, they thought this was like a big financial problem, and it was just going to take money to solve. We helped them realize quite quickly that they had more than their financials sort of at risk here. They went with this type of data breach. The personally identifiable information of their loyalty customers had also been lost to some degree. And with that, they were then responsible to disclose to the Canadian regulator whose information had been lost and at what scale. So our objectives sort of became threefold. Like the first was to quantify who had lost their personally identifiable information. Two was to quantify the fraudulent redemptions that had happened. And 3 was really, I say crisis management support, but it's really stop the bleed. So this attack is still happening. How do we stop it from getting bigger and bigger as, day 1 moves into day 2, moves into day 3? So that was the business problem that we were faced with. So, as the process we described earlier, we next went into data collection. So we said, okay, what are sort of the touch points where someone's using the app, someone's walking in the store, someone's making a purchase, that we can start tracking their journey. So if you look on the left, I give you an idea of the scale of data that we're dealing with, but we're dealing with billions of transactions, billions of records. This becomes like a pretty big data problem. And we had 4 or 5 significant touch points along the customer's journey. So as they're first creating their card, when they're calling into the call center, as they're checking their points, as they're at the checkout, at the point of sale. These are all points where we sort of get a pulse on how that customer is using the app. So what do we do next? So the big problem here is that we wanted to create, a risk scoring model, obviously. So, we need to basically score every redemption transaction that's happened since, the very first fraudulent transaction until today. We need to identify which ones are meeting that threshold where we say, this is likely a fraudulent transaction. This is a risky transaction, a risky redemption. But to build that end-all be-all model, that's going to take on the order of months. We're going to need to go through those validation sessions. We're going to need to iterate a couple of times. We need to continuously train this thing. Not to mention just processing and stitching together, on the order of 8 billion transactions. Just the processing time is going to take a while. So how do we stop the bleed while working toward this end objective of eventually scoring every transaction that we have? So the approach that we came up with was this. Let's give them some quick wins by identifying, patterns of their risky behavior. So they already had some idea of new ones, right? So as I mentioned before, when a new device was added to this card, that was an indicator of risk. In the data science world, what we would do is we'd create a feature. So we'd go through a process called feature engineering. We'd integrate that feature of, what is the device's age on the card into our risk scoring model of the transaction. And then at the time of redemption, we would take that into account and say, okay, this redemption happened on a device with a device age of 3 days, and that means that it contributes X to the score. So in doing that, we sort of split the problem into 2. Let's first create these very, business-driven analytic tests to build our feature set. We can show them the results of the analytics tests very quickly, quantify what the potential impact is, and then when we get to the point where we have enough of our feature development completed, we can move into the data science and produce that final result for you. So on the left side, where we're doing data engineering, we're giving you some quick wins. We're showing you where the problems are happening, how to stop the bleed. We're giving you confidence that the bleed, yes, has stopped. And on the right side, we're eventually going to get to that point where we can say there's X million dollars of fraudulent transactions out there, and here's the list of customers that have been impacted. So that was the journey we chose to go down. So I'm going to quickly switch over to a demo of the tools that we created, and these are sort of interactive views. And I'll explain why I'm showing these to you. So the first one here is really what made it real in the first place, that there was a data breach happening. So the main point of this dashboard here is this time series that you see. What the time series is showing is it's showing attempted logins per minute. So where you see this little gray sort of bumpy trail at the bottom, those are your successful logins. And the blue peaks are your failed logins. So what we're showing them here, and this was really the first time that the business believed that that a bot was attacking their website, was when we were able to show them this and say, okay, on the right side, you have a good minute. In a good minute, what does that breakdown of error messages look like? So, 77% are successful logins. You have a couple incorrect password, very few, no account exists, and here's sort of your distribution over your error messages that are coming back to your customers within a single minute. And the total number of attempts against your site in a minute is about 300, and that's, sort of, even that is a high volume minute for you. Now, on the left, we're looking at a minute where you have a bot attack happening on your site. You have, more than 6,000 attempts against the site within that single minute. So that's just extreme beyond what you would expect even in your, most popular shopping time. And so we see no account exists, incorrect password, and successful logins. Now, the business isn't concerned with no account exists, incorrect password, because that is a failed login attempt. The potential impacted customer population for this 1 minute is this 314. That's where they start to get nervous, because there's some breakdown of individuals within this minute of this 314 customer population that are legitimate logins. This is me logging into my own account. But hidden within that 314 number are also fraudulent logins, where this bot or the site's attacker has managed to get in successfully. So the story that I wanted to show you here was, this is how we really made it real for the business that they were actually being attacked by a bot. Before this, they'd heard that there was a lot of activity going on the website, but they had no idea of the scale, and they weren't able to visualize it or really understand what that meant up until this point. So this was about making the problem real. Next, I'll give you a quick demo of the scenarios and the tests that we created. So what this represents here is, this is what we call the self-reported population. This is giving you a pulse on the number of people who called in to say that their points had been stolen. So before we did any analysis or any analytics, we knew that there were 7,000 customers impacted, totaling almost $2 million. And on the bottom, there's this time series of when the fraudulent transactions actually happened. So although they may have called in, sometime in May, we would go back into their transactions and trace the fraudulent redemption back to, some transaction that took place back in January. So this was providing them with, the real stats around what customers had called in. So we know the number of customers impacted is at least 7,000, and the number of points lost is at least 1.8 million, or the dollar amount lost. So what we did then was we built, and what you'll see across the top, these are all different business scenarios that we built to quantify some risky scenario that the customer might be exposed to. So I'll go to the next one, malicious devices. So I'll just choose a couple from here to explain them to you and show you how we're presenting this back to the business. Because as I said before, I think one of the real challenges that we struggle with in analytics is how to tell the story back to people who aren't familiar with the underlying analytics. And this is how we chose to approach it in this case. So malicious devices, what does this mean? This means that the device that was responsible for a self-reported transaction, so imagine that there's an iPhone that I know about out in Quebec. It's done 7 redemption transactions. People have called in to say that 6 of those were fraudulent. So 6 of those 7 redemptions that device performed were fraudulent transactions. Here I'm, making the assumption that 7th performed on the device which has been labeled as a fraud device is also a fraudulent transaction. So I'm taking the Samsung Galaxies and the iPhones that are out there in the world that performed these fraudulent transactions, and I'm looking for other transactions that were performed by those same devices. So what that tells me is I'm pretty confident that this, unless the customer called in and misreported and said, hey, I've had, all my points are missing, but really it was them. They spent those points. Those are the only anomalous cases in this population. Otherwise, I'm catching the phones belonging to fraudsters and the other transactions performed on those phones. What that's telling me is that if I were just to run this test in a silo, it's going to yield me 6,000 customers. And above and beyond those that have self-reported, I know that an additional 2,000 customers are impacted. So I go back to the self-reported population, and I have something like 7,000. And then if I were to make the leap of faith and say that, okay, I trust this test, I think that all of these are bad, I now know that I'm adding another 2,000 to that population and another $500,000 to my losses. So we continuously built up, working hand in hand with the people who really understood how these points could be used to build up, what does it make, what makes up a risky transaction? So we have things like you're redeeming out of your home province. So I live in Ontario and I'm redeeming in BC. How often does that happen legitimately versus how often does that happen for a fraudulent event? So as we work our way from left to right, we're sort of losing confidence in this test sort of by itself. So item number 7, risky item redemptions. That's talking about I'm buying a set of electronics with my points. So a typical pattern for fraudsters, but also very popular among like the normal population as well. So we're gaining less and less confidence, and therefore, like if I were just to go to risky item redemptions, you'll see that this number just skyrockets, right? I don't honestly believe that there are an additional 21,000 people who haven't noticed points are missing from their cards. I don't think the total problem is actually $6 million, but it could serve as an indicator into that eventual model that we're going to build. So this alone might not be strong enough, but it's going to be a feature that I consider when I go to that final data science stage. Okay, so I'll just quickly head back into this presentation. So what happens after we have that entire that testing set? So we built up our gambit of features. We put those into a linear regression model, scored every transaction, and eventually we identified something like $7 million in fraudulent redemptions, impacting something like 300,000 customers. So that armed the business with, I know exactly which customers' accounts I have to freeze, I know who I have to make whole again, I know what I have to disclose to the regulators, and I have enough information that I can create an insurance claim so I can get part of this money back because I'm the victim of fraud, basically. So I think we'll pause here for any questions around sort of the loyalty fraud use case and the demo that we had. So happy to field any questions now.
We had a question from someone asking about Tableau versus Power BI.
Mm-hmm.
So I just gave a quick answer in the chat. I personally, I haven't used a Power BI, but I think Tableau is a little bit more intuitive and easy to use. It has a bigger capacity to handle a larger amount of data. You can connect to like a lot of different database sources depending on like what your use case is. And I think there's just like a really big network of Tableau users worldwide. Like you can get a lot of good inspiration from the Tableau community. But Tom, if you work with Power BI or if you have any insights for that.
I think Power BI is also a very strong reporting tool, but the time to learn, I'd say, is a little bit longer. I think Tableau is easier to pick up, and it's easier to make a clean looking report sort of right off the bat. But they both have very similar use cases, and I think they both have similar flaws in that neither of them can write back to a database, and so I think the decision between whether to use Power BI or whether to use Tableau is really your level of comfort. There are very few scenarios in which one does something that the other just can't do.
We have another question. Have you ever had your analysis questioned from the insurance perspective?
From the insurance perspective, very rarely. And that's just because of the level of diligence and the working papers that we provide. If we're, our approach is essentially provide transparency, so it's just a flood of information. The insurers usually take a look at that information and they have to make a decision if they're going to, hire an analytics team to try and challenge the models and our approach. But if your methodology is sound, if your methodology is one that you can stand behind, then they're less likely to go to that level of work to try and validate it. Now, what they often do is they'll schedule like a questions and answers session, and during that time they'll challenge you theoretically. But to do like a separate model validation is very rare.
I don't see any new questions coming in, so we can move over to the next.
Okay. So Jenny, I think I'll pass it over to you to do the forensic and analytics targeted one first. We want to take just a moment to talk about some general career advice and what's helped us, both in general into moving into industry and then moving into analytics as a practice.
Yeah. So in particular, so just a little bit more background for me personally. I came from an audit background, and for my 8-month co-op term, I moved into our core forensics group. So in this group, I got to do a little bit more traditional forensics accounting work. And what I found, and if you're interested in this route in particular, I think it's really important to leverage your past experience where you can draw on skills that are relevant for forensic accounting. So building on your business acumen skills, finding experience where you can challenge your analytical and your research capabilities, and also attention to detail. You're going to be doing investigations and handling a lot of different data and documents. So those skills, I think, are really important. I think it also be great to get your CPA. And I think if you're in the master's program, you're on track for that. But you could also get another designation called the CFE. So this is the Certified Fraud Examiner designation. And that'll just solidify your knowledge for forensics and your ability to conduct investigations. Now moving to forensics analytics. So I think that the same advice for forensic accounting. So having the business acumen skills, having the analytics and attention to detail remains the same. But I think that there's another piece in that you have to be familiar with some of the technologies that we might use on a day-to-day basis. So like SQL and Tableau. And even if you don't know those technologies, if you're working in a new place where you are doing anything new, I think it's important to demonstrate the willingness to continue learning, whether that be on a job, raising your hand to be on a project that you might not have that much experience in, but learning on your own and developing that skill set is really important, and I think has helped me in my transition into the analytics practice. Anything to add, Tom, for the forensics analytics piece?
No, I think that's good. Did you want to talk about taking time off before you begin full-time? I know you took full advantage of that. Yeah.
So I know, like when you start master's, it's like you go right into school again for another 8 months, and then you're studying for a couple more weeks for the CQ. So it is really stressful, those 9-10 months. So if you have the ability to maybe push your start date or request for some time off before you begin full-time, I think that would be a really good mental break for you, so that when you're able to join full-time, you feel refreshed and you have that break between school and work. And also with work, you have limited vacation, so might as well take advantage of it before you actually start full-time. And that's what I did before I started, and I feel like it really allowed me to be in a good mindset and place to start and do well for full-time.
Thanks, Jenny. In terms of other general advice, I think just wanted to highlight again the importance of communication in analytics. Someone had asked the question about being challenged specifically by the insurers, but I think we're often challenged internally as well as by our clients directly. So it comes back to that point of you can only do analytics insofar as you can describe it. If there's something that you can't make your mom or dad understand, it's likely that you're not going to be able to use it in the business world, because the people who are ingesting it, who are meant to trust this thing, just won't understand what you're trying to get across to them, how you went about it, so they won't end up using it. So I think taking some time to develop that communication or those soft skills is really important. In analytics, it's one of the biggest challenges that we're constantly faced with, is trying to describe in layman's terms what we're doing with the latest in machine learning or clustering or any of these approaches to modern analytics, basically. The second point I wanted to talk about is the peer group that you're establishing. So I think this comes almost to like a cultural question within the organization. So as you're going for interviews, I think on the interviewer's mind, one of the questions is, is it going to drive me crazy to sit next to this person for the next 4 or 5 years? Because they're really assessing what you would be like as a peer. So as you're going into the interviews, you should be asking yourself the same question. Is this the right fit for me? I know that can be really hard when you're looking for a job, but once you land that job, you'll find that those are the people who you're spending the most time with. So I think it's really important to consider the culture of the workspace that you're trying to enter, and ask some questions during your whatever interviews you go for that sort of probe into that. I think the interviewer will be happy to field those questions. Often organizations are very proud of the culture that they're fostering internally, and you want to make sure that it's the right fit for you as well. Otherwise, you're not going to be happy working there. I think my last point was really around fulfillment. So one of my roles at Deloitte is I'm a coach for a lot of my peers, and what that means is I help them through their career journey. So I think one of the common themes that's prevalent in our generation is, I'm happy with my job, but it's not, is it what I want to be doing for the rest of my life? Is this really giving me everything that I need? I don't know. So this is a common problem that I see with people in our generation. Is this question of fulfillment, and am I making the right decision? Should I stay here? Should I go somewhere else? And I think what I've learned in my experience is that you can find fulfillment in ways that you wouldn't have expected before. So, one of the things early in my career, I was really questioning if this was something that I wanted to continue. I liked it enough, but it wasn't challenging me in all the right ways. Like I really wanted to be interacting with more people in more of like a development. Like I wanted to be developing my peers. I wanted to be teaching. So then I spoke to the people around me and found opportunities to do that even within my current role. So you'll be challenged with this question of fulfillment as you get settled into the workforce. And I think you should. My advice would be to just keep an open mind about how you find that fulfillment in your current role, rather than maybe looking externally first.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that, I think it's really useful to kind of going with the third point to leverage your connections and your peers just to start the conversation, because within your existing team, there might be something that you want to do and you just didn't know until you initiated the conversation, and hey, like now you know that you can actually do that within your existing team. So I think having conversations and making use of your team is really important.
Great. So now I think we're right on time. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, so we have one question.
Sure.
How would you determine when the data breach first occurred if you didn't have information surrounding the failed login attempts?
So if we only had the financial transactions and the call center logs, that would still be enough to find out when the data breach sort of first occurred, because we would start to see financial transactions associated with those call-in events. So, I get a call in on December 31, I've lost 600 points. I trace those fraudulent transactions back to 7 days prior. I know the data breach happened in approximately that time frame, or I can make that inference. So if we didn't have the cyber data, we could make inferences based on the transactional data and look at basically the first fraudulent redemption event and assume that happened around the same time as the data breach.
Any other questions from anyone? How many projects do you work on at any given time, and how long does each project take you? So for me as an analyst, it's nice to work on one project at a time because you have the ability to dedicate all your time and focus and resources to that one project. But I found that in my time here, it's usually juggling between two engagements. So typically for me, I'd have and be working on two engagements and sometimes some like ad hoc requests. And in terms of the duration of each project, it depends on, the client ask and what the scope of the project is. But in my experience, typically at least 1 month. Longest one that I've been on is 6 months.
I think if I go back to that model that we described earlier, the like finding the needles in the haystack typically takes much longer. So, if I'm doing a project like the one I described, where I'm looking for the fraudulent transactions and all transactions out there, it's going to take on the order of months. So maybe 4 months, maybe 6 months. If I am given a person, this person is on a terrorist watch list, find me their bad transactions, that's going to take 3-4 weeks. It's going to take a month or so. So I think it ranges. That's about it.
How would you compare your experience in audit and financial crime analytics? Does your experience in audit help your role in financial crime analytics? Tom? Just kidding. I think working in audit definitely helped my progression into forensics and financial crime analytics in general. You're working and analyzing a lot of financial information in audit. When you're doing all the documentations and sample testing, you're entering a lot of data and having to be really cognizant of all the information you're inputting in for your analysis. So I think in that sense, from a technical perspective and learning those attention to detail skills has helped, but also with like the client interaction perspective. So like in audit, I did control walkthroughs with the client. I had to present the information and explain testing to the client. And translating it to my role now, I have interaction with clients as well. So having that experience, I think, has definitely translated well into my current role. They are very different. I'd say audit it's a good foundation and starting point to learn about the foundations of business, and you get the opportunity to explore a lot of different industries depending on what clients you're working for. But with financial crime analytics, I feel like there's a lot more room to be creative and kind of think outside of the box on the different projects and different problems that you're solving. And I currently really enjoy my role. And I think the creative and thinking outside the box aspect is my favorite part. Are there any other questions from anyone? Okay, I think there's no more questions now.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. Oh, so we do have a question.
More. Did you develop your SQL and Python proficiency before you started, or was most of it on the job learning? So I personally am not proficient in Python, but I am a little more comfortable now with SQL. I did a little bit of SQL during my co-op experience, but I did some more learning after I finished co-op. So I'd say it's a bit of both. I did some learning on my own, but a lot of it was also on the job learning and kind of raising your hand and saying, hey, like I wanna do and be put on projects where I can use SQL more. And I think that the team itself, they're very receptive to that, and they'll try to find opportunities where you can build your skill set wherever it is you want to build.
Yeah, and my experience is very similar, Jenny. Like mine was mostly on the job that I learned it. When I first came into the analytics team, I was the least analytical person on the team, and because I had that business sort of experience from my consulting days, I was able to play the business role while on the job learning, the more technical skills. And now I'm one of the most technical people on our team. So,
yeah. Is there an intersection between financial crime analytics and tax? Have you ever dealt with a case of tax fraud? I personally have not.
I haven't either. I'm sure there are implications. I'm just trying to think of the reason why we wouldn't, Jenny. Might be the scale of clients, might be in the consulting world, we have, sort of these Chinese walls built between some of our functions. Like if they're an audit client, we can't do these consulting engagements for them. So if we're involved in their tax side, we may not be able to do analytics for them. So it might be the way that our business is set up that we haven't. It's a good question, though.
Yeah, I think on that front, the fraud, at least identifying the fraud, would have come from a lot from like government entities, like, because obviously there are people that are trying to, or organizations that are trying to avoid paying taxes, and sometimes maybe not the most legal methods. So that's perhaps one way. Or if you're talking about other ways, like where they're trying to launder money, I think there's are some applications that, but the incentives and structures are a little bit different, which is probably why there's not. And the goals and how the firms consult with these organizations when it comes to taxes is a little bit different than in other cases. But I think that's all the questions, unless there's any more. But I appreciate the presentation, really great career advice, and really cool demos that really demonstrate the usefulness. And I really liked how you emphasize that the analytics is only as good as it can be explained, which I think is something that as students and for other aspiring analytics professionals is really important. You can learn all these really great tools and functions in analytics, but it's not going to be usable if other people can't understand it.
Mhm.
So thank you very much. So this presentation is part of your discussion board this week. So please please feel free to watch this video again. We want to catch some points and then post your discussion on the discussion board, interact with other students, and best of luck on your discussion boards this week. And thank you two for taking time out of your busy schedules to present to my students.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone.